This is a book by my friend Willie Carruthers called Playing the Bass with Three Left Hands. There's one chapter that I'd like to read, actually, so here goes. Waves of Joy. As the ship pitched and rolled, low waves of vomit rolled across the toilet floor and broke gently against the unconscious figure of the recumbent drummer, who was snoozing peacefully in the unfresh tide with his head on his arm. Mercifully, he had somehow seemed fit to keep most of his face away from the contents of other people's stomachs. When the ship pitched back to stern, the vomit rolled away from him, broke against the far wall under the urinals, gathered force, and then made its way back across the toilet floor towards him as the ferry plunged into another huge trough of water. It had been a rough crossing, but not for Jonny Mattock, who was probably dreaming about something related to drums while being blissfully unaware of the fact that he was being freshly exposed to a gently lapping tide of partially digested food every 30 seconds. He was fairly well coated in the stuff, so it seemed that he had rolled over a couple of times in his sleep trying to get comfortable. I stood in the reeking bathroom, stepping over the rhythmic waves of puke and considered the best options for both of us. Jonny Mattock was not taking drugs to make music to take drugs to. Jonny was not very good at taking drugs at all. By our standards, he was a total amateur. I'm not saying this in any way to disparage the man. He still remains the best drummer I ever played with, or at least the one I found it easiest to play with. Jonny's drug was drums. Everything else was secondary, and he was possessed by a sense of enthusiasm unrivaled by anything except his own ability to drum with unusual precision, grace and flair. Despite this, he was shit at taking drugs, and he was from Northampton. People from there were understandably a little more jolly than people from Rugby, and although we kind of mocked them for it, we were probably a little envious of the fact that they could easily laugh easily without the help of heavy narcotics and dinosaur wiggly pills. The first time I saw Jonny, he was playing a show in the back of the Blitz in Rugby with a wacky Northampton band called Apple Creation. I remember this incident not because I got chatting with Jonny or because I enjoyed his drumming. I noticed Jonny because he was wearing a kaftan. "Look at that twat in a kaftan," I'd said rather uncharitably. I had narrow tastes at the time, and they did not involve smiling drummers in kaftans. I liked the Stooges, amphetamine sulfate and beer, not the friendliest cocktail in the world. Anyway, there we were a few years later, and here he was, conked out in a paddling pool of puke on a pisshouse floor in a ferry on the way back to Britain, and something had to be done about the situation. I went back to report my findings to the rest of the band, who had also been searching for him. He was passed out on the toilet floor, and it's not pretty, I said. He looks comfortable enough, but he really shouldn't. Come and have a look. The reasons for Jonny's largely comatose state were fairly obvious. Prior to getting on the ferry, he had approached me and said, "I've got this lump of hash that somebody gave me. What do you reckon I should do with it?" Jonny didn't smoke a lot of hash, but we had led him astray a little bit, so now he did, but not very often. "Don't take it through customs, man," I advised him, but perhaps I should have been a little more specific, because 10 minutes later he came up to me and said, "I ate it." He laughed like a maniac, which he often did anyway. "The whole thing?" I said in a slightly disbelieving tone. "Yeah," he said, looking a bit worried but still smiling. "You're going to be fucked up, Jonny," I said. "That's nearly a 16th. You better find somewhere comfortable to sleep on the ferry." It was a rough crossing. The ship rolled and wallowed in the stormy seas, and most of the people on board lost their lunch in the process. One puker would cause a chain reaction of puking from queasy passers-by until it had become a veritable festival of reckless regurgitation. I've never seen so much vomit in my life. There was a group of school kids on board, and I saw most of them throwing up in the toilets and along the carpeted corridors with youthful abandon. It was quite a funny spectacle if you had a strong enough stomach. During all of the entertainment on offer, we had somehow lost track of Jonny. He crashed out in a chair for a bit, nearly been sick on the manager's wife Tracy, who was on her first and last trip away with the band, and then gone walkabout. That was how I came to find him on the floor of the toilet. Jason and I looked down at Jonny from a safe distance. We both said, "Jonny!" No answer. We poked him with our puke-covered boots. He stirred, but he didn't wake up, so at least we knew he wasn't dead. It would have been most careless for a drummer to choke to death on someone else's vomit, although it might have improved record sales briefly. "Shall we pick him up?" I said, with absolutely no enthusiasm whatsoever. Jason shared my lack of enthusiasm for picking up the sick, sodden drummer. He looks pretty comfortable, and we're nearly at the harbour. Let's come back and get him when the ferry docks, he said. We both nodded, and he left him where he was. When the boat finally docked, Kate Radley and I volunteered to go and help Jonny from the boat. He was still serene in the pool of now unwaving vomit. Kate started laughing and wrinkled her nose as we both steered ourselves for the unpleasant task of helping our stinking friend to get off the boat and negotiate customs. I reached down and looped an arm under his while keeping my face as far away from him as possible. I hauled him to his feet and Kate looped her arm under his other shoulder. Eventually we managed to get him into a kind of upright position, and he even started making a few noises that suggested he might be approaching wakefulness in some way. Ah, he sort of said, as we encouraged him to put one foot in front of the other, while the two of us supported his weight. I tried very hard not to think about vomit and how much of it was getting on me. What are friends for anyway? Jonny was becoming more awake. We managed to get him out of his temporary bedroom and into the hallway. Eep, he said, and then smiled and staggered a bit, while Kate and I laughed and gagged and tried not to drop him into the little pool puddles of stuff he was dribbling onto the carpet. Staggering and laughing, and with very little help from him, we eventually bundled Jonny into a seat in the most isolated corner of the van, so that he could sleep off the last remnants of his foolish indulgence as far away from everyone else as possible. Mercifully, we were not stopped by customs on the way off the ferry, and Jonny didn't have to answer any questions he was in no condition to deal with. Many people were leaving the ferry in similar states of discoordination anyway, and it was almost impossible to tell if any of them were drug-related. We drove Jonny back to Northampton and dropped him off at his mum and dad's house, telling them he had been suffering from a touch of seasickness. He was fairly coherent by the time we dropped him off, and his mum didn't seem too concerned about the fact that we had returned her only son to her in a state of considerable inebriation with sick in his hair. Of course, he was still smiling.